We had, in the centuries ago, it was popular in the Catholic Church to speak of the 3 days of the Vigil of All Saints Eve, and the Day of All Saints, so October 31st, the Day of All Saints, November 1st, the Day of All Souls, November 2nd, as All Hallows Tide. Most of you are probably familiar, the word Halloween that we get from that is actually from All Hallows Evening. And hallow means what? Holy. That's why we say, hallowed be thy name, holy be your name, Lord. And so during that time, and actually the whole month of November is dedicated to remembering the faithful who have gone on, the saints, and the church suffering, and the church in purgatory, those souls in purgatory that are still preparing to go to heaven. And it's a great time to pray for them. So what I'd like to do is this morning for us to pray that prayer together that most everyone knows about for the saints, for the faithful departed, eternal rest. And I want to say that where's Kelly? Kelly's father passed away just a few days ago, and has asked us to pray especially for his soul. And when we do that, we'll have his name in that prayer. But we'll be praying also for all the other faithful departed. Rose told me the All Souls Day is actually the anniversary of her husband's passing as well. So we'll answer that. His name is Thomas Finn, so we'll put his name Thomas in, but then at the end we're praying for all the souls. Okay. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Eternal rest grant to Thomas, O Lord, and may perpetual life shine upon him. May his soul and the souls of all the faithful departed, through the mercy of God, rest in peace. Amen. Amen. And I'll just ask, if you will, to be praying for me and my family. Next week, the reason I won't be here is I'll be speaking in a parish in Nashville, Holy Rosary, in case you have any friends in Nashville. And I'm speaking about spiritual warfare. I often get asked to do that because of the books I've written about it. And every time I do, there is a spiritual assault. The enemy doesn't want me to do it. He tries to intimidate me. He usually gets a hold of my family, kids and grandkids. And sure enough, my grandson had to go to urgent care. Turned out to be really bad bronchitis. We've had other kind of uncanny things, like somehow, even though she never touched it, my wife's alarm was set at a really odd time this morning. So, and we've had trouble sleeping. Anyway, it's all the typical stuff. It always happens. It's uncanny. Digit problems with equipment, things like that. So if you would, just during the week, if you think of us, say a prayer for us, and maybe say the St. Michael prayer or guardian angel prayer on our behalf. And we've got a team praying there as well. Some of the stories I could tell you about. For instance, I had one time I was to speak at a parish in this diocese, but on the other side of the state. And at that time, it had been over 30 years that I've been speaking. I'd never had to miss a speaking engagement because of illness. And the morning I was to go, I woke up and my right knee was swollen twice its normal size. It's so painful I couldn't walk on it at all. And so I had to call them and cancel. We eventually did it. But and this particular parish had been having some very strange kind of things going on, which is why they wanted me to talk about it. And so went to bed that night, but we came back. Then after that, they put together a prayer team and started praying for the next occasion. And it was a very beautiful, powerful time together. My son is now about to be 30, but he was always so full of it. So one day, he comes up to me. He would have been, a lot of these are from when he was, say, 4 or 5. And he says, "Dad, I have a question." And I'm always thinking, oh boy, here it comes. So, did I tell you this one before about, okay, let me know if I did. He says, if Jesus knew everything, right? I said, yeah, he was God, he knew everything. He said, well, if he knew everything, why did he ask his disciples questions? This from a, 5-year-old, I guess. And I took the strategy that every father from time immemorial takes when a child asks him a question he needs a little more time to think about, and turned it around and said, well, tell me, son, why do you think Jesus asked his disciples questions? And he gets this disgusted look on his face. He says, well, I think Jesus asked his disciples questions just to see if they knew the answer. And they looked at me as if to say, and I was doing the same thing with you, and you just failed. So, yes, Elijah. Oh, my goodness. Maybe next time I'll tell you about my daughter who became an Arian heretic at the age of 4. Oh, my. So, anyhow, it's great to be together. We'll talk about apocalyptic literature today. If everybody should have a handout. if we get far enough through, I've got a second handout, we'll go into a second section of material on the wisdom literature, but it just depends on how much time it takes us to do this. So if you will, let's, if you're new, you should have a little bookmark that has the prayer that we always start with. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord my God, bestow upon me an understanding that knows you, diligence in seeking you, wisdom in finding you, a way of life that is pleasing to you, perseverance that waits trustfully for you, and confidence that I shall embrace you at the last. Amen. The Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right, so we've continued our overview of the Old Testament, and we'll have the New Testament next. It's beginning to look like we'll probably finish up Old Testament in time, just about in time for Christmas. So we should be able to launch the new year with the New Testament at last. And, we've been looking at the book of Daniel and some other books, but in particular we looked at several different parts. We talked about how there was a part of the book of Daniel that has falls into that category of literature, that genre of literature that's called apocalyptic literature. And what's the book in the New Testament that is basically mostly the book of Revelation, right? There are other sections. So for instance, in Matthew, where Jesus is talking about the end of the world, that's called the Matthew's apocalypse, or the little apocalypse. And it's an important thing to understand, in part because it has certain characteristics of the way it's written that if you don't understand them can be very misleading. So there are certain passages with poetic language descriptions that if you just take it on at face value, it's going to be very misleading. And that's not the intention, is to take it at face value. I remember back in my days before I became Catholic and came from a tradition that said, we take the Bible literally, everything, all literally. And even by then I knew, well, that's not really the case. So one time God was telling me, well, those Catholics, they talk about, they don't take things literally in the scripture. And of course I reminded them about, well, Jesus said you got to eat my flesh and drink my blood. Is that literal? And, oh, no, that's symbolic. But another thing he would do is with this, so I said, okay, the book of Revelation, when you have a beast that comes up out of the ocean, what is it? Is it a lion, a dog? Oh, no, that's symbolic. It's really, Antichrist or whatever. No. See, I thought you said it was literal. So anyway, every tradition recognizes, whether they admit it or not, that there are some things in the Bible to be taken literally, and other things that have a deeper meaning, that they are describing something that's not quite so obvious. And when you're talking about the end of the world, something that hasn't happened yet, and other kinds of realities, it shouldn't be surprising to us that people will be using language that's intended to be very deep and have several layers of meaning. And so what we talked about this last week, what does the word apocalypse mean? Unveiling, the manifestation, the revealing. So that's why we call the book of Revelation the Revelation. It's the apocalypse. That's another name. If you're reading older books and it refers to the apocalypse, the capital A, it's usually not talking about the end of the world, it's talking about the book of Revelation. So let's talk about kind of general characteristics. And as I say these, I think if you know anything about the book of Revelation, you'll begin to recognize this. But keep in mind, we're also talking about the book of Daniel. So the first, Daniel's visions are a form of apocalyptic literature. And what are the characteristics then? First, apocalyptic literature contains secrets about the future. It's not everybody knows, but God is giving something. If it's true apocalyptic literature, if it's genuine, if it's God has actually revealed, then what God is revealing are secrets of the future, or knowledge that's possessed only by God and by His chosen ones. So in Daniel's day, if you were a Babylonian peasant, if you're a Babylonian noble or whatever for that, these things were not going to be revealed to you, because to the rest of the world they're hidden. That's why they have to be unveiled. They have to be unhidden. They have to be taken open that way. And the big framework of it is that apocalyptic literature shows the present age that you're living in to be evil, largely evil. That doesn't mean that every person's evil, everything's evil, but that evil predominates in many ways, and the forces of darkness are pressing the holy ones of God, the holy people of God. So you get that in Daniel, you get that in Revelation, both. So it's not kind of a, it's not a pretty story. Apocalyptic is never a pretty story. And then it focuses, within that kind of evil dominating the world, focuses on the battle between good and evil. And those are depicted in stark contrast. In apocalyptic literature, you don't have a lot of grays. You have mostly black and white. It's very clear where the evil is, very clear where the good is. And I think if you were to ask apocalyptic writers, but isn't there a lot of gray in the world? They'll say, well, yeah, but if you pull back the veil, you begin to see things more clearly, that really there is black and white. And so let's just thought I'd throw that out. That's someone's conception of what the apocalypse might look like if it were to happen today. Thought that would be a pleasant picture for your Sunday morning. Tom?
I was thinking about, what I seem to encounter is not so much apocalyptic thinking in the workplace or in social life, but conspiratorial ideas.
Mm-hmm.
This is a conspiracy of the CIA or the Democrats or the government or something like this. And that to me, that kind of sounds kind of like what we're talking about here.
Yeah, a little bit, except that, unless the people think that the FBI and NSA and other things are going to bring about the apocalypse, then it's a different kind. This is ultimate, this is talking about ultimate stuff. Yeah, which I'll be talking about more in a minute here. So, that's a kind of an older picture of the apocalypse. It's, we might say, pessimistic about the future of the present age. It expects it to grow worse and worse without hope of improvement. So things are going to get really bad. But always then with the hope that the good triumphs over evil. So even though it's part of its message, overarching message is, yeah, things really are bad. And guess what? They're going to get worse. But in the end, God wins. In the end, good triumphs over evil. So it looks to the last things, the close of history, the end of the world. If the vision of the book were to stop at the next 20 years or whatever, when things are so bad, it would not be a book of hope. It has to look all the way to the end, to the close of the age, to the end of the world, in order to find that great hope. And so, how does it portray these things? What does it use? Well, it typically involves what we might call mystical visions, or dreams, or apparitions of supernatural beings, who would usually be angels. Could be other kinds of things. So this is where it begins to get kind of complicated in interpretation, because, as we all know from the dreams we've had, what you experience in a dream doesn't usually look quite like what you experience in this life. Sometimes it does, but it can get pretty wild out there in the dream land of dreams. And so it's going to be stunning, shocking, startling in the picture that it gives you. So it makes use of striking, even bizarre imagery. More about that in a minute, but you can think about the book of Revelation, especially where you get creatures that have a woman's head and the body of an insect or something, and they're flying around. You say, oh my gosh, that's really bizarre. This is why, like I think I've said before, back in the 60s, you had all these people say, hey man, what was he on when he wrote this? It's almost hallucinatory. Uses a lot of animal symbolism, and we'll see that as we talk about. Uses numerology. Now that's a broad term. There's some kinds of numerology that get into weirdness. This is just simply a statement that it assigns a mystical or cryptic, in the sense of a secret significance to numbers. And just that, in that general sense, then that's a part of Christian tradition. So if I say the number 3, what do you think? Trinity. The Trinity, right. If I say the number 1, right. If I say 4 Gospels, or the 4 corners of the earth. 4 is actually a number that refers to the earth, things on earth. So 3 is divinity, heavenly. 4 is the earth. You have 4 corners of the earth, 4 winds, 4 directions.
12.
Yes, 12, which is
The apostles.
the apostles and the tribes of Israel, right? So 12 times 12.
144 perfection.
That's right. And then 144,000 full.
Everything.
Everything. How about 7? Completeness, perfection. So that's heaven and earth together, 3 and 4. What about 6?
6 is sacred.
6 falls
Not
short
good enough to
of
be
7. 6 falls short of 7, so it's the number of sin. How about 666?
Nehru.
Okay, so the 6 tells us, right, number of sin. Why are there 3 6s? Because it's the sinful one, the evil one, trying to appear as God. So Trinity, it really at heart it really is 6. It's trying to have an appearance of 3, like God, and that's why Antichrist doesn't just mean someone opposed to Christ. And we usually think of anti as meaning opposed to, but it means someone trying to take the place of Christ. You will worship me rather than him. I will save you rather than him. So try to take the place of God. So anyway, there's a certain numerology understood in that way as a very broad term, and there is a Christian form, but you also you have, like I said, some kind of strange occultic kinds of numerology that try to do all kinds of things with numbers. And Catherine even mentioned about we talked about, and I haven't looked up your answer yet, about how since the Hebrew letters and the Greek letters, rather than those alphabets, rather than having a separate system of numerals or numbers, they simply used the letters of the alphabet. So alpha in Greek and aleph in Hebrew was the number 1, could also stand for the number 1. And beta and bet for 2, like that. So a lot of people would do that and say, oh, look, this name has this many letters in it. If you add them together, you get this number, and that number means so. Kind of interesting how they do that. Okay, what else about apocalyptic literature? Who's that? Yeah. It makes use of this kind of imagery we're talking about, of symbolism and of numerology, to write in what we could call a code that only the intended audience can understand the book's meaning. So I'm using Revelation a lot more right now than Daniel, which is really our focus, but if you were, say, a Roman imperial soldier and you're looking for Christians and stuff, and you find a book that had the kind of symbolism that the book of Revelation has, you probably wouldn't pull it in and try to burn it with the things like Gospels that you knew were Christian, because you wouldn't know what the heck it was talking about. You have this beast coming out of the water, and this harlot riding on top of the beast, and all this kind of stuff. So it's a kind of code that, for the time being, because the church is being persecuted, so for the time being, they're able to share this book and talk about it. And you're talking about it at work, and your colleague is going to say, "Ooh, you're a Christian." We'll turn you in. Typically filled with angels and demons. Arises in times of great adversity when the intended audience needs assurance that God is in control of history. You ever been in a thought of a time like that? It's good. Yeah, maybe like now. So it encourages people to cope with this evil world, hold on until the end, when God will deliver them from this world and establish a new one. So if you were asked to say to me, this part of the book of Daniel, the apocalyptic part, or the book of Revelation, or that section in Matthew 24 that we mentioned, Apocalypse, if you could only use one word to describe kind of the theme of the book, what would you say? I would say hope. It's about terrible things happening, but the theme, the purpose of it is hope. The one novel I wrote is, the publisher gave this awful title of My Visit to Hell. It sounds like somebody was writing a little essay in September about how they spent their summer vacation. It's based on, I borrowed roughly the storyline from Dante's Inferno, his visit to hell, and put it in a 21st to 20th century setting, and I updated it for the 21st century a few years ago. But anyway, the point is that people would often say, what's the book about? And they expected me to say hell, because all the action takes place in hell. But I would say, no, the book is not about hell. It's set in hell, but it's not what it's about. The book is about grace, about the grace of God. And so it's the same kind of thing here. You could say, what's Revelation about? Oh, it's about these angels and these monsters and all these terrible things happening and stuff. Well, what's it really about? What's the theme? It's hope. And that's why it's in the Scripture. Because it's there to give us hope. All these passages are. Now, there's another modern apocalypse. Is that Atlanta? I don't know. So, as apocalyptic literature, Daniel chapters 7 through 12 that can be compared, as we said, with the book of Revelation, which actually is the apocalypse, literally meaning the revelation, the unveiling, the disclosure. And the term apocalyptic today is more generally used to mean simply having to do with the end of the world, but that's why. Because these books that were the unveiling, the revelation, the disclosure, themselves had to do with the end of the world. And so that's why, you know, I'm showing my age, but how many of you ever saw or at least heard of the Mad Max movies? Yeah, okay. Those were apocalyptic movies because they're kind of showing the end of the world as we know it and the beginning of a new crazy world. So it's almost an anti-revelation in that case, because you read, I remember one of the things when I saw that movie that I was left with just a sense of despair. It's, oh, Lord, thank goodness it's not going to be that way. Those kind of secular apocalypses tend to be that way. They show the upheaval in the world falls apart, and then the new world that replaces it is usually worse. So thank goodness that the apocalypse we know about ends in hope of a better world. So, as I mentioned, Jesus' words in Matthew 24, sometimes called Matthew's apocalypse. They refer explicitly to the apocalyptic text in Daniel, but other places as well. And then there's a second place in Matthew where Jesus is before the Sanhedrin the night before he's betrayed, the night before he goes to his death on the cross. And when they're asking him questions, he responds by talking about, you will see the Son of Man on clouds and coming in glory. And that's from Daniel, and he's referring to himself. So that's very important that we realize that Jesus himself made the connection that this passage in Daniel, whatever else the rest of Daniel's about, the passages he refers to are very clearly, he's talking about, say they apply to his second coming at the end of the world. So one good reason to read Daniel, but we got to read it carefully. Okay, let's just look at a little bit at some of the passages we're talking about. Oh gosh, I forgot my glasses. Eyes are fine, and my arms are too short.
I got some Costco special.
Okay, thank you. All right, so let me just read a little bit, starting with Daniel chapter 7, verse 1. And you'll get an idea. And as you listen to this, think about all the kinds of things we've just put up on the screen here. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions in his head as he lay in his bed. So, okay, we mentioned that, right? Dreams and visions. Then he wrote down the dream and told the sum of the matter. Daniel said, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. Okay, so four winds coming from four directions that represents the earth, the realm of the earth, stirring up the great sea. And I think I may have mentioned last time that the Jewish people, ancient Jewish people, were not a seafaring people. They're kind of like the hobbits in the Lord of the Rings that way. And they saw, they didn't do much along the coast there. But when they did, they kind of saw the sea as a great, terrible, dangerous thing. The sea had been the place where some of their invaders had come from. The Philistines and other so-called sea peoples had invaded from there. Terrible storms, all those things. If you weren't much of a seafaring people, you can understand why the sea would represent not commerce or trade or adventure, but instead would represent danger to you. So I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. And four great beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. Then as I looked, its wings were plucked off, excuse me, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand up upon two people like a man. So it's kind of like a transformer. Those of you who know the toys, the Transformer toys, they look like cars, but then all of a sudden they stand up and they're like a man. All right. And the mind of a man was given to it. And behold, another beast, the second one, like a bear. It was raised up on one side and had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And it was told, arise, devour much flesh. After this I looked, and behold, another like a leopard, with 4 wings of a bird on its back. And the beast had 4 heads, and dominion, power, authority was given over to it. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. and it had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke in pieces and stamped the residue with its feet. It was different from all the other beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another horn, a little one, before which 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. Another way to translate that would be a mouth that was boasting. You know, how great he is. As I looked, thrones were placed, and one that was Ancient of Days took his seat. Who's the Ancient of Days? God, beautiful name for God the Father. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. Get same kind of language in the book of Revelation. His throne was fiery flames, its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came forth from before him. 1,000 thousands served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. I looked then, because of the sound of the great words which the horn was speaking. And as I looked, the beast was slain, and its body destroyed, and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. All right, that's the scary stuff, right? Okay. Then here comes the hopeful stuff. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man. Remember, that means someone with a human appearance. But later on, Jesus is going to talk about the Son of Man, who he is. And he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. Does that sound like from our description of apocalyptic, what we're talking about? And again, I mean, it's hard to kind of know what some of the details mean. But then, interestingly enough, I might as well read it. Daniel gives an interpretation. Starting with verse 15. As for me, Daniel, my spirit within me was anxious. I bet. The visions of my head alarmed me. They would alarm me. I approached one of those who stood there. So one of those who's standing out in the court, thousands, 10,000s, 10,000. So I can imagine Daniel's kind of at the back. He comes up to the first guy in the crowd that he can find in the back of the crowd there, and asked him the truth concerning all this. So he told me and made known to me the interpretation of the things. These 4 great beasts, or 4 kings, who shall arise out of the earth. But the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom, and possess the kingdom forever, forever and ever. Then I desired to know the truth concerning the 4th beast, which was different from all the rest, exceedingly terrifying, with its teeth of iron and claws of bronze, and which devoured and broke in pieces, and stamped the residue with its feet. And concerning the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn which came up, and before which 3 of them fell, the horn which had eyes and a mouth that spoke great things, were seen greater than its fellows. As I looked, this horn made war with the saints and prevailed over them, until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was given for the saints of the Most High, and the time came when the saints received the kingdom. Thus he said, as for the 4th beast, there shall be a 4th kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all the kingdoms. And it shall devour the whole earth, and trample it down, and break it to pieces. As for the 10 horns, out of his kingdom 10 kings shall arise, and another shall arise after them. He shall be different from the former ones, and shall put down 3 kings. He shall speak words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and shall think to change the times and the law. There were people back when we just had the daylight savings time change, right? Back when that was first established, there were people who thought, this is a sign from the book of Daniel. He's changing the time. Whoever's the president, whoever, by having this executive order change the times, he must be the Antichrist. But they also thought the same thing when they started doing a unified time system. You know, in the old days, before the trains were so common here, everybody went by local time according to the sundial. And that's how your time was measured. When they started doing trains, the trains went so fast between places that it didn't work to have every place with its own time, because none of the schedules matched. So that's when they went to a system where you had time zones and standard time, and people thought, no, it's the Antichrist. They're changing the time. He shall think to change the times in the law, and they shall be given into his hand for a time, 2 times, and half a time. But the court shall sit in judgment, and his dominion shall be taken away, to be consumed and destroyed to the end. And the kingdom and the dominion and the greatness of the kingdom under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. Their kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey them. Here is the end of the matter. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly alarmed me, and my color changed, it went pale. But I kept the matter in my mind. And then there's more, a vision. Vision of a ram and a goat. The battery must have went out. Okay. Tom's my fix-it man. Thanks, Tom. So,
More demonic interference.
yeah. All right, I'll try. Let me know on the back if you can't hear my voice. I'll try to make it good and loud. So, if you were to just pick up this book and start reading there without any of the background stuff we talked about with apocalyptic literature, would it make much sense to you? No. And even with the interpretation, that helps some. But like so many things, especially the stuff that seems to be talking about the end times here, we don't know the full meaning yet. I think I've said in class before that the ancient Jewish people could read passages like the suffering servant in Isaiah and all the things that were messianic prophecies about him suffering. Thank you, Tom. That makes sense. About having a suffering Messiah, but then there were prophecies about a conquering Messiah, a king and a judge. And so it was hard for them to kind of figure out how all that gets together. And when Jesus came and he fulfilled the part of the prophecy about the suffering servant, who's like a lamb led before the slaughter, and by whose stripes we're healed. But he wasn't the conqueror that everybody was kind of focusing on. They wanted a Messiah who would get those dirty Romans out of here and we'd have our freedom and our independence again. He didn't do that. So a lot of folks who who rejected him for that reason. But then after everything happened, you get that story of a few of the apostles or disciples walking on the road to Emmaus on that first Easter night, not Easter Eve, but night, when Jesus had been raised from the dead and the reports are getting around, and they're walking to Emmaus, and Jesus, without their knowing it's him, shows up, and they start talking about, we don't know what happened. We thought he was going to be the Messiah and save us and all this thing. And then, he was crucified, but now there are reports that he's alive. And Jesus says, you're kind of foolish and slow to understand. Let me explain. Okay? Explain it to me, Lucy. And most people aren't. Unless you're my age, you're not going to get that. Sorry for all these cultural references from 50 years ago. So he begins to explain, and he shows how, if you go back through the scriptures, it says he explained to them from the scriptures, the law and the prophets, why the Messiah had to suffer and die. And so looking back, people could see things and say, oh, that's what that prophetic verse meant. That's what that passage meant. It's going, now that it's happened, we can see it. But guess what? A lot of the stuff apparently in the book of Revelation hasn't happened yet. And so for a lot of us, it's probably going to be only after the fact when we look back and say, oh, that's what it was talking about. So you always have to be careful in trying to read the book of Revelation. I think you've got it figured out. There are at least 1,000 people who have done that. They've all got different books, all disagreeing with each other. The first few chapters, I think, are very, very clear and plain because they talk about how we're to relate to the Lord now, and talking about returning to your first love and those kinds of beautiful things. But I'm just kind of saying we'll come back to Revelation at the end of the New Testament overview. But to keep in mind, so this is one reason why you don't see these passages in the mass readings very much. Because if you just kind of throw them out there in the mass readings and you don't have an explanation, they would confuse and disturb a lot of people. But still very important because some of this almost certainly had to do with Daniel's day, just like most of the prophets. But a lot of it, especially with Jesus' confirmation that he's the Son of Man who comes when he comes back in judgment, that's described coming before the Ancient of Days. That there is at least some of it. You remember we talked about the vision where there was the great image and you had the golden head and on down to the feet of clay, where we get that expression from. And people have tried to interpret it as the great empires, the Neo-Babylonian, and then the Persian, and then the Greek, or Hellenistic, under Alexander, and then the Romans, and then the 10 is kind of coming up out of the Roman Empire, which is the European Union, which then, once the European Union got more than 10 nations, then they had to say, well, it's not that after all. So, the important thing of all this is the conclusion, where it points. We're not going to know until the end of the world what all these details mean in every way. But the main point of the book is not to try to figure out, what this beast represents. It's to see that the message of hope, that when things are bad, when the world looks like it's falling apart, for some of us it sure seems to be right now, the world looks like it's falling apart, God nevertheless is in control. He's behind the scenes. There will be a great fight between good and evil till the end of time. And when things look the worst is when then the Lord will trump everything else, come back and bring his kingdom. There have been several, in the history of teaching about Revelation, about the apocalypse, the end of the world, there have been several kind of positions that people take about how, obviously how things will take place, but one of the positions has been that God will come back and establish, or that before Christ comes back, there'll be 1,000 years that's established as a great, wonderful time, and of peace and prosperity, and then at the end, Jesus comes back. And there are actually Catholic versions of that too, but the tradition of the church has long been that, first of all, that those 1,000 years mentioned in the book of Revelation is not to be counted literally 1,000 years. But second, that at the end, whatever we have to go through to get there, that as the Catechism puts it so beautifully, that the church will have her own passion to go through the same way Christ went through his passion. We will imitate him in that way before the final resurrection, in the sense of the final victory of God over the enemy. So I just want to encourage you to be really careful, even if it's a kind of a Catholic version of certain kinds of end times things. It's going to sound like a commercial, but a book I wrote some years ago when all this stuff was being talked about because of the notion of the rapture that's popular in certain evangelical or fundamental circles. I wrote was really the first Catholic critique of that notion of the rapture. Where does it come from in the Scripture? Why is it popular here? Is it in the Bible at all? What does the Catholic Church teach? What are the Protestants traditionally taught even? So it's called, that book was called The Rapture Trap, A Catholic Response to End Times Fever. So you might want to if you're interested in these things, you might want to take a look at that book. It's still in print, even though it's been some years now. But,
So I was just curious, we know, I've lived here most of my life, and I know that, we get this idea of the rapture and this apocalyptic, and also mainly from the evangelical churches, but what are the mainline churches like the higher Protestant churches like Methodism, Episcopalianism and things, do they have this same theology?
That's part of what I show in my book, that this notion is a very recent notion historically. You get little bits like it, like Cotton Mather among the Puritans had a similar idea, but not the same as some others. But if you look at all the major architects of the Protestant Reformation and the major denominations, none of them believed it or saw that in Scripture. So Luther didn't believe it, Calvin didn't believe it, Wesley didn't believe it. It's something that, so it's not even really a Catholic Protestant argument. It's kind of a particular group of people whose position has become very popular through certain historical circumstances, revivals and that kind of thing in America, that it became so popular that you could sell millions of those books, left behind books, because of it. And yet, if you go just back in history a little bit, nobody even had ever heard of the notion, including the major Protestants. Yes, Steve?
I just think, it's tempting but not fruitful to get caught up in trying to figure out the map of end times. And it's depressing to think I just got to gut it out until the end, which seem to be the two options often. And I would encourage us to be reminded that there's a lot of vision in the book of Revelation and from the Old Testament that we see during the Mass. When we say holy, 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 we are saying the words of Isaiah's vision in the Mass. That eternal heavenly banquet connects to us. So we are given opportunities for hope and consolation that we are on the winning team. We don't have to wait to the end with our head down, waiting for another blow from the evil one. We are going to participate in the victory every time we go to Mass if we have our eyes open and our ears open. So I'd encourage you to look for that when you are, and listen to the words that Father says during the prayer of consecration when you go to Mass. So you don't have to think, I'm in an 18-inning World Series game, and I guess we're going to win to the end, but I'm going to go to sleep by then. We get a taste every time we come to Mass if we have our eyes open.
Thank you, Deacon. So there's a whole book, The Wedding Supper of the Lamb, Scott Hahn, that shows how the book of Revelation and all that it does is actually structured in such a way to help to reflect on the structure of the Mass and the things that happen at Mass. So thanks. I didn't mean to sound so pessimistic. We do win, and yes, you get a taste of heaven. You get a taste. The Mass is actually, or the Eucharist is. Many Catholic writers are talking about it as kind of the eschatological banquet, which means the banquet that points toward the end. That every time we do it, we proclaim the Lord's death until He comes. So we're looking forward to His second coming. And every time we have the Eucharist, we are proclaiming His death and His resurrection until He does come back. We're looking forward to that. And what a comfort that is. Yes, but
when we talk about the present age,
mm-hmm.
That's everything that's happened after Christ, right? Or is it?
Just depends on how you're using it.
Okay.
I'm just saying for the writer, so for instance, the book of Daniel, he's talking about the present age, his own time, as being evil and all these horrible things happening. But for us, the present age would just be now. Some people, you could talk of the church age as the present age as well. That's how Augustine interpreted the notion of the 1,000 years, that it's symbolic for the whole age of the church. But again, we can't get too specific or detailed. God has never revealed to the church a lot of the details and specifics, and so we're left to speculate, but we have to be careful about our speculation. Did I see another? Yes.
Yeah. So the end of the world, it's kind of a difficult phrase for us to understand because I'm just saying that it's used a lot. And for most of the ancient world, the end of the world didn't mean the planet was coming to an end. It meant that our society, where we are, like the Roman world, is coming to an end, or the Hebrew perspective of the world is coming to an end. They didn't literally mean the planet was coming apart. And we've seen the end of the world come several times, especially for the Jews. When they were conquered by the Babylonians, temples destroyed, into their world. They rebuilt it. The Romans destroyed it. That's the end of the world. So, the end of the age may be a better term. And Jesus uses that in all the discourse. Would you agree with that?
Well, except that, when He comes, it's the end of history. So it's not just the end of an epoch. When He comes again and we have Judgment Day, then all the dead of all time will stand before Him in judgment for the general judgment. There's no history after that. After that, what happens is a whole new creation, a new thing. So I would say that, end of the world as we know it. That's why apocalypse, in certain ways, is kind of apocalyptic, has come to mean that, end of the world as we know it. But I do think, let's do that. Okay, but when He talks about the end, I think it's pretty clear He's talking about final judgment and what happens.
The discourse.
Well, during that time, he's answering two questions. Or he's mentioning in Matthew, I think we may have talked about this before, where the apostles ask two questions. He's just said that the temple will be destroyed, and so they said, well, when will that happen, and what will be the signs of your coming? Because they think it's going to happen at the same time. And in the discourse, he replies to both questions and says different things. Some apply to the year 70 AD when the temple was destroyed. Some apply to His final coming. But that's been confusing for a lot of people because they assume that it's all at the same time. It wasn't. So he is talking about the end of one age in the sense of Jewish, since they go into exile again after that destruction of Jerusalem. But the other things seem to be pretty clear about the end of the world because of the judgment that's happening for all the individuals. At least that's how I would see it. So, yeah, Adams, I don't know why this is, sorry something's happened here, but it's the devil. As we say in Jordan, it's pure devil. It's pure devil. And,
why did Martin Luther, what was the reason that he said like the Pope is the Antichrist or whatever? Because I know that a lot of people don't, a lot of like Protestants don't believe that now, but I know back in the day I think a lot of people did. What was his reason for saying that? Why did he start saying that?
Because he really didn't like the Pope. I mean, that sounds funny, but you have different figures.
Pope was pretty bad back then anyway.
You have different figures throughout Christian history who are identified by a large number of Christians of one sort or another as the Antichrist. And it's always the bad guy, the one they see as the bad guy of their day. So Nero, Stalin, Hitler, some of the Holy Roman emperors. During the American Revolution, there were lots of American colonists who thought that King George III was the Antichrist because he was the enemy, and they saw this as a kind of apocalypse. Some of them believed that Jesus was that they were going to build the kingdom of God in North America and then usher in the return of the Messiah. Lots of ideas. Again, if you read The Rapture Trap, it's all in there. A lot of different stuff there. But yeah, I mean, for him, the Pope was Antichrist. The Pope was trying to take the place of Christ and that kind of thing. But he wasn't. There've been all kinds of others with different things, different people. Some people thought, that Hillary Clinton was the Antichrist. I'm not joking. And I thought, okay, there was that movie. It was called The Devil Wears Prada. Prada? How do you say it? Prada. Yeah, right. Does the devil wear pantsuits? I don't know. So anyway, but yeah, you have all kinds of people. Saddam Hussein during the first Gulf War, there were people who thought he was the Antichrist. It's that's why you have to be really careful about trying to take these books and plug in the values from the newspaper. Well, we don't have newspapers anymore. From the news media, and plug in and try to make the equivalent. I'm convinced that in the end, when it finally happens, we'll all look back and say, "Oh, that's what it meant." Okay, now I understand. Gosh, how's our time? Okay. Well, we'll just finish up with a few more questions, and then I'll turn this over to Father to fix the equipment. Yes. Oh, here.
It's not really a question, it's just an observation. When you talk about spiritual warfare, which I firmly believe in, I think that getting so involved and getting so hung up on trying to figure these things out, that's a form of spiritual warfare because it stops you from recognizing the bottom line of hope. Because you're so involved with trying to figure this out and how awful it's going to be and who is it and all of that other stuff. Instead of recognizing the bottom line of the whole thing being hope. I think that when we start to struggle like that, we need to talk to somebody that's going to, what are you thinking? That's going to kind of pull us up by our bootstraps and get us out of that quagmire. Because otherwise, the devil is just happy as a lark. Especially if you're going to be sharing those negative thoughts with other people. He's having a ball. So
there are two things the devil really likes us to do. One is to be so preoccupied with him that he's got all our focus. The other is to believe he doesn't exist at all. Those two extremes. The reality is in the middle somewhere that yes, he does exist, and yes, he is active, but you don't want to spend all your time, thinking about him, looking for a demon behind every bush. So it's true individually. It's also true, I think, as you're saying, if we're trying to get the big picture. I came out of a tradition that had a lot of focus on the end times and that kind of thing. And even when I was still in it, I remember kind of shaking my head and saying, guys, you're losing the big picture, and you're not going to figure out the details anyway. So why wrestle with it? Just focus on the Lord. So, good point. Is there another question?
No, I was just going to add something to that. One thing that's always helped me with that whole problem is if you look at the saints, and you look at the struggle that they went through in their life, whether they were martyrs or something like that, and you meditate on those things, and you keep those thoughts in your mind, then what you're doing is you're involving yourself, I don't know, theologically, whether it's the communion of saints that we do, and so you have that added assistance through those means, you know. And that's basically why we have the saints, you know, that they teach us about how, I mean, Maximilian Kolbe dealing with the Nazis, putting in a starvation bunker. St. Stephen, you know, shown by the religious authorities. All those terrible things. And I think if you keep your mind focused on those ideas where those people actually died, for example, martyrs or the great minds of the church or something like that, then you don't have to worry so much about the devil. Because he doesn't want any part of those things.
Yeah,
And
we
the other
do.
thing, too,
We can't ignore the devil altogether. That's why I've written several books. But I agree with
the
you.
miraculous medal. You take the miraculous medal, which is an image that we have had in the church, it's improved sacramental in the church. And you don't look at the fact that Our Lady is standing there, but you also, all you see is that she's standing on top of the head of the snake. You know, and that becomes your focus, where you're missing the whole point of the sacramental, you know. And I think that's like you were saying, that's what the devil does. He wants us, because he's proud and probably vain and everything else that goes with it, so he wants us to, you know, focus on that.
So, fascinating stuff. Next week, again, we will meet, but Father Neil will be speaking. I don't know his subject yet. But then 2 weeks from today, I'll be back, and we're going to get into the wisdom literature, which is totally different from this. It'll be very, very interesting kind of break contrast with all of this, the wisdom literature. Fascinating, lovely stuff. Some of my favorite stuff in the Old Testament. So, yes, Dr. Mark?
Yeah, Paul, sometime, and I thought it was an interesting story. I grew up Catholic, born and raised. I never had any desire to look at any other denomination, but I know you converted, and I think the deacon did as well. And it would be interesting to know why. Maybe not today, of course, but sometime you could share that story again.
Okay. In the meantime, if you go to the EWTN website, you know, they have an archive there. Just type in Thigpen in the search box. And my conversion story was the first chapter in a book called Surprised by Truth, edited by Pat Madrid, and it's there. So,
Thank you.
yeah. And Deacon, maybe we'll have you sometime.
I didn't make it on the EW.
Brand X.
But in one word, ecclesiology. The great thing about being an Episcopalian is also the most dangerous part about being an Episcopalian. You are your own magisterium. If you decide this is what the devil meant, there's no one to contradict you. In the Catholic Church, we have a mama and we have a papa, who eventually says, I love you, son, but if you're going to persist in saying that, you can't call yourself Catholic. I need a shepherd.
Well, let's pray. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. God bless. Pray for me this week.
Was that a front desk yesterday?